Okay, finally we're here. What's up, YouTube? What's up, YouTube? I just finished recording the debate on dependency injection and mocking. So I'll just introduce you to the debate itself, and then you're gonna watch it here. All right. Well, I didn't just finish recording it. We recorded it last night. A bunch of people came over. We had the debate. Then we stopped the recording, and then the discussion continued on. And I wish we were recording that too, because a lot of that was also interesting. I have some of it that was captured on audio but not video, and I'll try and see if it makes sense for me to include that in this video, in this edit. I know I enjoyed myself. I think the participants enjoyed themselves too. At least I did hear the audio. I haven't seen the video yet, and the audio was certainly indicative of that fact. And I hope you all enjoy the video as well. Please let me have your feedback. What you like, didn't like, what you wish was talked about or was not talked about, or however it is, right? Just give me your feedback and I'll see how I can improve these debates moving forward. Now, I know there are some technical challenges that you will see in this video. The production quality, that is, the video and the audio. The cameraman and the sound man that I had was not up to the mark. He kept, dozing off or not paying attention to the camera and the audio. As a result, there are situations where the video has stopped recording. Luckily, the audio kept going. So you might find clips where there's a blank screen or it's a paused screen with the audio moving on. And that's probably because I feel that the audio that was captured was important for the debate, for the audience to understand. So I'm going to leave that in. And of course, I'm going to have to work on finding or training this cameraman and the sound man to do a better job, or somehow make it all work. My problem is that I get so caught up in the debate part that it becomes very difficult to disconnect from it. And I'm of course wanting to participate, but I can't do the multitasking too well. So anyway, enjoy this video and I will see you next time.
Watching your video though, I will say that the straw man that's built on this is because you mentioned every once in a while like people that use your systems that had dependency injection for everything, like without a doubt.
Yeah.
And that I can't say I'm for that.
I think we need to start recording because that starts to get at the issue.
I'm going to let you start, Scott, because
okay. Wow.
That's the trend. Okay, so you're saying?
I was just saying that as we start out here, we should, like Bill was talking about, we should level set on what we're talking when we say what we're for or against, because I can't say I'm for dependency injection everywhere all the time on every class. I think it has its place, and so it should be used in the right places versus all the wrong places. So,
okay. So we'll get back and get a sense of what the right places are.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, Bill, did you have? What about you guys? Let's start this way.
I don't have anything to say right now, so maybe start that way.
Are you for or against?
I'm trying to. So we went over this when we did this, and I don't have.
Edit.
You can cut this out. It's not like we're streaming straight to the internet. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like I'm directly against it. I'm directly against misusing it, as Scott kind of said there, where it's like you apply it to absolutely everything. But at the same time, so many people misuse it that if you're going to start using it incorrectly, you may as well do it incorrectly all the way throughout the application. So that way, at least you're consistently wrong.
Yeah.
Right. It's easier to fix something that's consistently incorrect than it is to have something that's like patchwork, where in some places you're using it correctly, in other places you're using it wrong, and then you have like this third paradigm where you're just like randomly newing stuff up that has no business being newed up in a particular location. It's like pick a model and stick with it.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
Consistency is huge. I agree.
Absolutely. I agree with both of them in the fact that I think a lot of time in software development, people learn a technique or a tool and they say, ooh, I have a hammer and everything's a nail. And that becomes a big problem later down the road because once you get different or unique edge cases or unique situations, you need to have a wider range of tools to use. And that's where I've been burned so much on DI. I should say DI is one of the ones I've been burned most on because it's most widely used and pushed out as the glorious, amazing tool that it is. And so everybody's using it incorrectly, in my opinion. And then I have to come in and clean it up.
Okay. Austin?
Yeah, I agree with everyone too. And then I actually lean more towards now not using it, although I did read an article. So for the place where you would be good to use it, I guess, is I read an article about like if you're making a library for like other people to use, and they're specifically talking about like do you use dependency injection or service locator in your library. It's actually more beneficial to use maybe dependency injection if you're developing a library for everyone else. But other than that, I actually do lean more towards, I guess we'll talk about it more later, but service locator, having used both now.
And the other option is, do you need to inject anything, especially in the case of a library? Right? I mean, forget inject, do the consumers of your library need to know all of your dependencies? I mean, that's...
Right, yeah, so if you don't need it at all, then don't use it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, Abe?
So I think simply that, so most of what has been talked about so far is in the context of you have a project and you have decided to use DI. Where I have a challenge, with DI is you have a project and you need to decide, should I even use DI for this project to begin with? It seems like what is common in industry is most people just decide, oh yeah, I have an application to write, an ASP.NET application. I just use DI. Or the .NET Core now supports DI, so therefore I need to use DI too for this specific project, even though the project in question may not be particularly DI appropriate.
Okay, so when you say, should you be using DI, is like DI or something else? Like, I'm not sure, what do you mean? Like service locator or like what
Right,
okay.
Basically being able to weigh options and
Right.
decide what's the most appropriate option for the
Right.
project in question. Yeah.
Bill?
Well, I think when you talk about dependency injection, you have to specify, are you talking about for use with testing, which I think most of what we're talking about here is, but there are also business uses for dependency injection.
Okay, so I don't think anyone can say that they use dependency injection for testing. They're not saying that that's the point of dependency injection to start with.
Okay.
In their mind, that's good design, right? So they're using dependency injection because that's the whole point of not having classes know of their own dependencies. It's a side benefit for most DI people.
Yeah.
Testing is a side benefit. It's not the reason to do dependency injection.
When it
comes to production use, you don't need to inject anything for production use.
Well,
I mean, it's just as an architectural level approach to doing your application, I don't think it makes any sense. That's not an architecture, that's a technique. And so
Yeah, it's a technique of dependency inversion.
right.
Right?
So
That's the reason they want to do dependency injection. It's an
But-
implementation of inversion of control.
there may be certain circumstances where that makes sense, but to say just in general all of our dependencies are going to be handled by this magical framework, I don't see the point.
Okay, so I'm going to ask. I mean, I want you guys to ask each other questions. I just want to be the one that's doing the questioning. But I'm going to be playing devil's advocate no matter which way you go.
I think Bill made a good point though about the using dependency injection for like pluggable architecture, so where you can just scan a directory for any type of components.
Okay, I will question anyone that says they can use dependency injection sometimes in an application, which is all of you. Right? Show me how you can decide sometimes to inject something and not inject something when you're in an application. I've gone deep in the guts of my system. Right? So in dependency injection, there's a configuration root, which is out there
Yeah.
at the outside of your application, typically like in ASP.NET in the the startup CS or whatever. and the root is here, and you're not injecting anything here, and then finally at the tail end you decide that you want to inject something. How do you pull that off?
Well, you can inject at a certain level, and then.
But where? How do you inject? Give me an example. How would you use an IOC container to inject something?
Like,
Sometimes. Anything sometimes. Like not all the time. Like you're not injecting everything, but injecting some things when you feel like it, as you were saying.
Like the meth framework is there for doing pluggable architecture. You can just literally just anything that actually you import in from that meth interface, and that's
Right, you put the attribute in.
yeah. And then everywhere else you just new stuff up the way you would without it.
Okay.
And then you
But
have
you
some
can't
and
use
you have not.
You can't use an IOC container.
Well, some people will use the meth framework as an ILC container.
Right. But so just to be clear, anyone that says you use dependency sometimes, you can't pull it off sometimes. It's either all or nothing. There's no in between.
For
It
the
doesn't
most
make
part.
any sense at all.
So
You're talking about the IOC container, where you're like resolving those through that, which is basically just a big service locator.
but because you're not passing it around,
Correct.
you can't decide somewhere deep in the
You're
custom
making it
system.
static, so it's accessed throughout your system somewhere, which is dangerous in that. But
Yeah, but then you can't decide to inject, meaning so let's say class A is not injected or doesn't have any injection. It's now using a B, and now B decided that it needs to inject its dependencies. So now A has to know to call on the IOC container somewhere and say I need a B. So magically it knows that it's now so now A has a dependency on the IOC container, which is never allowed in dependency injection, right? DI folks will not want you to know about the IOC container inside of a class. That's the service locator at that point.
yes, it is.
I honestly think that you're conflating the technique of doing dependency injection with the architecture of doing it.
No,
There are
okay.
certainly situations where you want to do this process.
I
And
understand, but
when
Bill,
you do that process, you want
you are
to
the
make
one-
it flexible enough.
Yeah, I understand that you can see I'm conflating the thing. They are hand in hand.
Mhm.
When I'm talking about dependency injection, I mean exactly what the entire community is doing. I'm not talking about simply having a constructor argument. I'm talking about the practice of dependency injection, which is typically performed by an IOC container.
Well, in that case, I see what you're saying. I'm not.
And we'll talk about what you're talking about separately,
Yeah.
the partials, which is a separate discussion. Right?
Yeah.
It looks to me that most people
From that perspective, then I would tend to agree. I don't like. I mean, IOC container is
What is the problem with IOC container?
well, it's a global thing, or else it's passed around thing to
No, it's
everywhere.
not. No. That's the whole point. The IOC containers are never passed around.
Well, they are in service locator. They are.
Okay, I'm talking about dependency injection.
Okay.
I'm talking about dependency injection.
Alright.
And you're talking about using a dependency injection framework, and that framework therefore does it for you without you having to look at it, right?
An IOC container, yes.
Right.
Not a framework, but an IOC container.
All right. Well, I just I don't like.
What is the problem with IOC container?
Well, I mean, once you add it, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
There's
nowhere.
It is everywhere and it's nowhere. It exists in your application, so everything has access to it at some
Right.
point.
No.
That's the point of
No,
IOC.
you have to
It's-
resolve. You have
so-
to resolve at some point.
You do. All right.
No, just Paul. Okay, so an IOC container, the dependency injection framework, the IOC container will say the container is in the root. It's called the configuration root,
Yes.
where you will configure the container, right? I need these classes or interfaces, whatever it is.
You define absolutely everything,
Everything.
all the interfaces and what classes it uses
Right.
to resolve those
From
interfaces.
that point forward, it knows of everything, but none of the other things know of it. Right? It's a one-way dependency. It knows of everything, but nothing else knows of it. So it's not known to the entire system. It's a very clean implementation, right, or design. Nothing knows of it.
What do you mean nothing knows of it? Clearly, you need to know something about it in order to use it, right?
But once it's
That
ready,
goes back-
Using it though.
That goes back to this point where everything down the chain, I guess, like has to be injected basically. So when he's saying as soon as you have like class A doesn't use dependency injection, but then class A will new up class B, and class B is expecting an
Something
interface
injected.
in its constructor. Well, because class A wasn't created by the IOC container, Class B can't have its stuff injected at that
Exactly.
point. A would have to provide whatever Class B needs.
It's an all or nothing. There's no halfway. You can't say I'll use it sometimes and not sometimes. Within the application, I'll use for this purpose. I mean, I just know what Scott is saying. And that was the original intent of dependency injection, where typically for orthogonal classes like logging, emailing, things where you just know you have to swap them out for testing. But it was not with an IOC container. It was simply the notion of injecting a dependency, right? But today, dependency injection is actually implied that there's an IOC container. I don't know any team of people that do dependency injection without an IOC container. That's just, they go hand in hand. It's like almost mocking dependency injection and IOC all go hand in hand. It's either all or nothing across the board for that. So
I've seen issues where people try to do it without, and then they have memory leaks. So I mean, it's always better if somebody's going to do it. People at home, if you're going to do it, don't try to write your own. Pick one and use it. You won't have memory leaks.
I mean, one of the reasons why I think IOC containers became popular and for the most part industry standard is because creating your own IOC management system within your application is really hard, and then you end up writing a lot more code than is necessary. Just having that abstracted away, which is what IOC containers.
So you're saying, I think both of you are saying, you need an IOC container, and so therefore, so that's one assumption, right? But therefore, don't build your own. Use the industry, the ones that are sort of built and tested by.
I would say building your own ILC container is deceptively easy because you can build one in about 5 minutes. But where it gets tricky is because now you're maintaining state, and if you don't maintain it correctly, you can hold on to references a lot longer than you originally expected, and that's how you're gonna get your memory leak. So. That's why I say I don't think it's on the face of it. It doesn't. It could seem deceptively easy.
Especially in ASP.NET, you got the transients, you got the singletons, you got the scoped, right? Because especially in like a multi-thread application, there are many paradigms at play, and you could pick one or more of those. And so, if you're trying to build your own IOC container, that could get pretty hairy. Yeah. But so we all agree that we don't like dependency injection across the board. Is that a true statement? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Definitely yes.
Huh?
Yes.
Okay. So then, what are the other options? Or what is, now you started saying something, Bill, with regards to business use case. So I want to just report on that. But just to be clear, give a proper example of when you say that. Because honestly, to me, it just sounds like polymorphism bastardized.
Well,
right, because it's polymorphism, but you're saying I want to inject my dependencies, but I'm saying, but that's just polymorphism.
Why is that polymorphism?
Okay, from my experience of working with people who do dependency injection, the only way they understand how to swap behavior is to injecting the behavior they need at runtime, right? I'm saying if a class A has a dependency of a B, C, D, where B, C, D are dependencies of a certain family, and A can order its behavior by using a class B or an instance of B or a C or a D, right? B, C, D being the same family. Why would I want to inject into a B or a C or a D at runtime? I don't want to know that. That's between A and B and C and D. Like, I don't want to be involved in that in terms of injecting a dependency to perform some sort of polymorphic behavioral change. A business tool, a business thing.
Well, I mean, you're going to have to figure it out some way, right? I mean, if you want this same function to be able to do different functionality, or you want it to use different dependencies.
How do you mean function? Like, what is the function? The method? Or a class? Like, what do you? Business function? What are you talking about?
Well, I'm trying to build on the example that you spoke of. If you have a set of functions, an interface, say, that several have, either the inheritance interface or a interface in C# terms, then that guy is going to go in and be used, and he can be used in the same way because of the interface. So it might be one method, it might be a whole host of methods that he uses.
Can you make it a little more concrete? I'm not following, but that may be just me. Can you make it a little more concrete as a business case example, so that it's even clear for the audience who don't have the option to ask the question?
So I guess my what I'm having a hard time understanding is from my understanding, we're saying that if we have A and you pass B, C, or D in, B, C, or D are different objects in my
Correct.
opinion.
Yes.
So
Different
then-
family.
So, okay, that's what
So
you're saying. Right.
if that's the case, having a interface they all understand wouldn't make sense to me because then it would treat them all the same.
Well, you can't, there's no point in, I'm talking about a situation where you've got the potential of using one of these options. And so, say you've got, coming up with examples on the spot
I
is
think I have an
hard.
example.
Do the car thing, car or the boat and whatever.
Well,
Okay,
Like,
Okay, I'll
Like
keep it
vehicle,
simple.
car, boat.
another example would be like log4net, the different appenders. So you would want to have each one of those is going to be a different implementation to write into a file, write into
yeah,
a web service,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so,
if you-
Scott,
so if you-
example, can you expand on that? Because
So it's
I understand there are different appenders for log4net,
right.
but there's no
So
need to inject them.
no, you don't have to. But I'm saying that would be a situation where you might want to have a loosely coupled framework so you could add a new one without actually.
it's sort of a plug-in type
Yeah,
architecture.
yeah.
I mean, you've got, are you talking about a log?
Close
file?
Plugin, can you
modification,
keep
open
plugins
source.
out of the picture? Because plugins are nothing to do with dependency injection.
Well, I think your
Plugins,
definition
no,
of plug-in is
plugins
different.
are not injected. Plugin is a dynamic runtime discovery
I'm
of
using
something.
the term a little more generally than that. I'm saying there's a set of functionality that this class performs or makes use of, and we want to be able to swap that out, what it uses.
Yeah.
So if you
To
have
me, that's polymorphism.
if you have a logging framework and you want to sometimes if you want to log to a file or you want to log to a database, you could pass in the persistence object, and it could do the appropriate thing. When you
Who's
instantiate
the one
log-
passing it in? Who's responsible for making that decision? Like, why is the other thing having to know of getting involved in that decision-making process, having to inject the database version or the file system version or whatever else? Why is there some third person? So there's a logger,
the caller?
there's a logger, and there's a persister. Right? Now there's somebody else that's involved in making that decision.
Right.
Why are three people getting involved in this whole thing? Why is it? If already there's two.
Okay. Well, if you wanted to, you could pass in an enumeration that says database, file, blah, whatever it is.
That's not
And
injection,
then-
is it?
And no, it's not.
Right.
You pass it in, and then this routine says, okay, he said he wanted this one, so I'll go out and use that.
Yeah, to me
The
that's
problem-
polymorphism.
And the problem with that is that every time I introduce a new persistence thing, I have to go in and modify that code.
No. That's an assumption you're doing. That's not required. You can add on as many new behaviors as you want without making any change to any code.
How do you do that?
I mean, how you got an enum somewhere, right?
Yes.
I would have a factory inside of the logger. Based on what you send me, the factory is responsible for creating my persisters. The factory is fully aware of every single persistor that's there today and in the future. So I don't have to modify any code. I would not write a system.
Well, if you have the enum, you'd have to, at the minimum, add another.
Yes.
Add a case for the That's about it.
But to me, I'm saying that's not a code modification. There's no huge change, right?
Right.
And I'm
It's a factory
keeping
modification.
It's no
You
worse
do
than
have to
adding something to
modify-
your structure map registry.
the difference is,
Yeah.
Bill. You're saying inject the dependency. I'm saying just use the factory. Contain
You could
the
do it with a factory.
container. The difference is the containment of the knowledge of the persistence mechanism in your example. It doesn't need to be outside. Nobody needs to know there's a database persistent now. Just the logger needs to know, right? There's no reason for anyone else to understand that there's 10 other things coming into the logger of all things.
I get what you're saying, but what he's saying is we go one step further and not have to tell anybody else. You just drop this new implementation in a directory.
Yeah, so
Voila.
the factory would do
You
the same,
have-
right? The factory would
Well,
do
you
the
still
same.
have to.
No, you have to modify the factory. in
No,
order-
no. Please, let's not make assumptions that I have to modify anything. Take my word for it. I will never change a line of code after I write the code today. For the next 200 years, it'll
So
work just
how
fine.
do you add
Just the
a new
way,
persistence mechanism into the factory without modifying
just
the
the way
factory
Scott
code?
said, right? You like MEF works.
Yeah.
You just drop that DLL in that folder with the new persistor.
Oh,
and the
so now
factory
you're
finds it.
talking about a plug-in framework.
Yes, but I'm saying you're adding on all these constraints. I'm talking it very simple. Class A doesn't want to know about the logger's persistence mechanisms or be involved in the different kinds of persistence. Why should he be injecting anything? Right? That's my first problem. If a logger needs to have the ability to have different persistence, I'm saying let the logger get involved. Why are you involving third parties in the whole thing? That's all I'm saying.
You've got to, I mean, at some point you're going to make that decision. The calling routine, the routine that actually instantiates the logger, might be a place where you'd want to specify how that logger persists its information. And if that's the case, then you pass in an enumeration, you just pass in the thing, and it knows that. I don't see any benefit to creating a new enumeration and passing that in, and then having it.
Okay, the enumeration, the new, what you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. The fact is, you have to tell it somehow that you want your thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you want, let's say you want to move from a database thing to a file thing. You
So
have to make some change in your end to do
Nope.
that?
You
No, you can
create a new persistence object, and then you just pass it along as long as it meets
just
the.
passing along is no code written on your end to make that happen. You don't say new A instead of new B now tomorrow. Like you're making some code change. It's not
In
magic.
the caller.
Yeah, I'm saying the same thing. The caller.
You don't have to though, because like you can have a directory.
Let's not get caught up on the amount of
Okay,
code.
okay.
I think we're all smart enough to make sure you can either write more or less code. I'm talking a simple idea is constructor injection of a dependency that I don't care about. As a consumer of the logger, I don't care about the dependency of a third person. It's my friends' friends are not my friends. That's how it works in software. Your friends' friends are not your friends.
It's a hard world in software.
You know the dot, right? So you're saying
Strictest Facebook settings.
the logger needs something, so I have to pass the logger something. But I don't know the something else, I only know the logger. Why would I need to know about the something else now?
Well, somewhere in the code that decision has to be made.
Okay,
So you're just moving it around to
I mean,
someplace else.
in both scenarios that you described, somewhere in the code that decision still has to be made.
Right.
It's not like, but what
You
Shiv
know what?
is saying is the two classes that you're working with directly you don't have to change them to accomplish your goal.
dependency injection is a better solution than what you're proposing. By that I mean the way dependency injection works today. Because nobody needs to know about anything else. It's auto magic. Your solution implemented with an IOC container is better.
Decision still has to be made at some point.
Yeah, but class A
You're
and
not
B
un-
aren't aware of it. That's the point.
A is
they
not
They
aware.
have no idea it's happening.
The thing using the logger is not aware of the logger's requirements, right? It doesn't know the logger needs a B.
Which is what Shiv was
Well,
trying
I'm
to
not
say with
saying
you don't have
that.
to change the code. You don't have to change those two classes.
With dependency injection, the way you're proposing it is worse than dependency injection with an IOC container, because one of the clean things about dependency injection with an IOC container is that nobody needs to know about anything. You just specify, I want one. Nobody has to give it to you. I mean, the consumer of the logger is not responsible for providing the logger with the persister.
Who is?
The IOC container will do it.
The IOC container doesn't make a decision. At some point, you tell the IOC container.
Whatever you do, Bill, there's no code, there's no knowledge. On my side, I say I need a logger. That's all I say.
I understand that.
How the logger needs its dependencies, I don't even need to know that. I'm never in the picture. I'm not in decision-making picture. I don't have to know about the dependencies. I'm not hydrating the dependencies. The IOC container will automatically give me a logger that has the right persistence mechanism in it. I was never involved in that decision-making process or in the knowing up of it. With your model, I'm now getting involved with it.
The calling routine.
Yeah, the caller is now, the user of the consumer of the logger is now suddenly getting involved with the caller, the friend's friend.
So you're saying, I mean, we're talking about logging here, so you could argue the benefits or downsides of that. But you're saying there aren't
Back-to-back
situations.
Subscribe now for our next.
Say that again.
Go ahead and subscribe now for the next conversation we have about logging, and go ahead and hit that bell button. So
Notify me.
Do you have a Patreon? Should we plug that too?
Okay, Bill.
I mean, if you move from a different circumstance, from one circumstance to another, I mean, you could argue the benefits or downsides of logging per se. But you're saying there aren't any.
I'm using logging just as an example.
There aren't any business scenarios where the calling routine does have business in indicating to the thing being called how it should work, how
Yeah,
it should
so-
do its job.
Right, and this may be me, but the way a lot of the patterns are define, for example, the strategy. In the strategy, there's two implementations in the book. One implementation says, do you guys understand briefly what the strategy is?
Mm-hmm.
The idea is there's a context object, and the consumer of the thing that requires the strategy says, hey, context, please give me, let's say, a compression algorithm of type A and then a B and a C. Right? So there's two models. One is the consuming code calls the context saying, give me this specific thing, like let's say, give me the gzip version of the compression. And then it uses an instance of that and compresses it. So it's only aware of the friend's friend, context being its friend, and the gzip algorithm implementation being the friend's friend. Whereas the way I implement the strategy is I don't want to know. I don't want to get in the middle of having to know how to do the compression and which method to call on what class. I'd rather say, Bill, can you just compress this and give it back to me? That's another implementation the different implementation of strategy, which is the one I use.
My question,
I don't
though,
want to know that.
is once you go to the next one you said, isn't that just basically factory at that point?
Yeah.
No,
No.
there's a big difference. Factory is producing a family of classes, but it knows nothing about what they're used for, who's using them, or nothing. It's simply hydrating an instance. It's not really getting involved in the nitty-gritty of the usage. Whereas the context is understanding it. So the context says, oh, your data is so big and it's better for me to use the gzip compression versus the lzip compression because it knows, it's very keenly aware of the algorithms. It knows which one to pick at the right time. The first implementation of the strategy, I need to know that knowledge.
Yeah.
So, like,
But there's
I'm
times.
not a compression expert. Now suddenly I'm getting the business of compression to tell the context which one to give me back.
But there's times when you do want it, when the
What
client
you
does
saying?
want to know.
Were you saying that the first the implementation of strategy was a factory?
No. I was saying once you remove the fact that the client picks the strategy, it sounds a lot like a factory.
Yes,
method to
in
me.
fact, that's what I say on my
Yeah,
page.
okay,
Yes,
yeah.
the first
Yeah.
version, the version that is talked about in the book
Yeah.
is actually in my mind a factory.
Yeah.
Towards the end of that chapter, they talk about, these are the problems with it, and, there's another way to do it like this, and they kind of gloss over it. But to me, that's the real value of a strategy.
Yeah, but I will say that there is uses for the pure strategy pattern where the client does want to know, does want to have a say so what strategy is using.
Then it's the factory.
Yeah, well,
I'd make that a factory.
well, because what I'm getting at is like if, for example, if we're writing an application that's doing fulfillment, then it might want the client knows it wants to use UPS or FedEx. So it's not like I can just say, hey, I need this fulfilled, and then allow the context to decide that. I know how I need it fulfilled.
Yeah. So I would use a factory for
Yeah.
that. I would just use a factory.
Yeah.
The factory is responsible for producing a USPS, UPS,
Yeah.
FedEx, DHL, whatever. And the business is happily wanting to use that, is knowledgeable about those things and
Right.
can use them the way they need it.
Right.
Which is typically for, so let's call it multi-method operations, right? Like it's not just a compress.
Yeah.
It's more than that. So because
Right,
the
right,
class
right.
is a much more meaty class. and it's
So what
very
you're
business-centric.
basically saying is, in the situations where it would make sense to do
We
depend.
lost- I didn't know. I was
Oops.
saying. Okay, sorry. I don't know how much of that conversation we lost.
No, all the good parts.
So in the situations where where dependency injection would make sense, you say make that a factory. So
Yeah, so for not factory, it could be n number of patterns. Okay, I mean, I'm not just hung up on I'm not saying the replacement for a dependency injection is factory. The replacement for dependency injection is all the other patterns, including factory method, factory, strategy, decorator.
isn't resorting to a factory pattern a more complex solution than simply sending UPS or sending
Who's sending it?
FedEx? The caller, because
The
he
caller
knows.
is no. Listen, if I call the method A, so class A is calling some method on class B. Let's say, for example, I'll say create order, and the order thing says, where the heck is my DHL thing? What? I'm trying to create an order. I don't care what you have to do about the DHL thing. Why are you asking me for the DHL thing? I'm asking you to create an order. Why am I getting involved with what you need?
But
it
the
doesn't make sense.
user interface say you got the information about what the
Doesn't
user
matter.
wants to do.
Maybe it's a config setting in the system that says on this time and day or for this state or that country use DHL. Why am I, being the consumer, being involved
if you as the consumer already know because the user has picked that, then you do know,
It's
and
not
you
about-
need to tell
okay,
somebody so it works.
When I say no, I don't mean like no because I've got a parameter in my hand that I'm saying no meaning I don't want to know. I'm not in that business. My job is not to know about DHL.
Okay, but if you have the parameter in your hand,
I don't want to know about anything. You don't understand. This is the design aspect. I don't care to know what's downstream from me. Does your manager want to know how you write C# code?
that's not the issue.
He's got Visual Studio on his desktop.
Depends on how intrusive the manager is.
I'm trying to make a point here. Friends are not your friends. There's a very clear distinction in object programming. You don't want to know your dependencies. Which is why dependency injection implemented with an IOC container is a cleaner design than what you're saying. You don't want to know your friends.
Yeah, I think a good point is it doesn't matter for little examples, but when you have giant systems and everyone's doing it that way and no one knows what's going on and new people come in, it becomes a giant mess. So the idea is just, you can do it and maybe you understand it, but just avoid it because if it's a big system one day, it'll cause problems down the road.
That's true. A lot of the problems sort of surface themselves in larger systems. Small system looks pretty cute.
Yeah, because even when you make apps at home, you're playing around, like you can make the worst design patterns work well, but it's because you have like one little thing you're doing, right? So
You build a little application at home. You have like 15 classes. How bad can you really mess that up, right?
yeah, and you know it well.
Yeah.
So
and you're the sole owner, so it's a lot easier to follow your own pattern and consistently follow it. Whereas on like a larger application, you're definitely working with a team of people. Might be one or two other people. It might be hundreds of other people. You have no idea who else is going to be touching the code at any given time.
Right.
So I think personally this is one of the challenges I found with DI in general, which is that the more complex the application is, the more complex the DI. When using DI within a larger application, the architecture sort of blows in your face. The more functionality you add into that app.
Because all the interfaces and all that.
Correct.
Yeah, and to build off of that, what makes it worse is if you're using, say, like structure map, they let you create like a registry, and then the top level where you're building the container, you can then just have all the references to the registries, and then the container will just consume those. But then you got to go, okay, if you're trying to find like where does this interface map to this class, you got to go top level, and then okay, which registry am I going to? Oh crap, I got to go to another registry. Like you might as well have a giant file and you have to search that file. Like I would honestly rather do that than chase a registry path if you're using structure map or anything that does that.
So then let's see if we can get a sense of why does dependency injection exist. For the most part, we don't actually agree. But we don't like dependency injection. That is the way it's used currently in the industry. So Scott, since you started us off.
Okay.
So you mentioned earlier that you don't believe in everywhere.
Yeah, not
sometimes.
everywhere now, yeah.
So do you mean IOC container or do you mean constructor injection?
Well, I do like constructor injection. I believe it's, and this is where I'll just disagree, right? Because I just like to have that contract of this is what this class needs. It's not sneakily coming in through a service locator. It's just nice contract, nice separation. It's just clean. And I would. Just
But the separation is the separation. I mean, does the separation need to be okay? Class A is using class B, so there's already a separation. The fact that B's guts are not inside of A implies that there's a separation, right?
But I would like to throw this out here real quick while we're in this transition mode here is another reason why somebody may, especially in an enterprise situation, may reach for dependency injection as the tool. Because one thing it does is if you say, hey, this is what we're going to do is dependency injection through constructor, and that's just one of the grandiose designs we're going to use, it kind of forces people to, it makes it harder for people to write spaghetti code.
Really?
Yeah, because if you follow news glue, then you might have other issues.
I have some applications
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce you to.
Yeah, no, Scott, so this is
First of all, you don't misunderstand. It makes it harder to write spaghetti code than makes
Not
it impossible. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you might
But
have.
why would it be harder? The only difference I'm seeing is, first of all, if I'm the guy that's writing spaghetti to start with, you think I can decide that there needs to be an A and a B class? Like, I mean, how would I know? I'm already writing spaghetti code, so like, might as well just write an A. Why would I decide there's a B now?
I mean, have you ever worked on an enterprise application where things were just newed up everywhere and static classes were everywhere, and then it worked, sorta, and then you had to add this new feature in, and refactoring it was a complete pain.
Yeah, but you can't.
What I'm saying is, to get in that situation is a little bit more difficult. Is if you start on day one with dependency injection, you say, and code reviewers are kicking out stuff that and new as glue is the frame of mind.
Okay, I can see that it might solve that kind of problem. But
Right.
the fact
I'm
that-
not saying it solves every problem, but I'm saying that might be one thing that you would want to use. You might have issues here where, as I know, people hate. There's like a lot of people that get frustrated when there's a lot of interfaces, excess interfaces, and also when you have these registries that for the containers that are just kind of behemoths. That can be frustrating to some people, but that can also be mitigated if people follow naming conventions and whatnot. So, but anyway, that would be a one reason why somebody might reach for that DI.
So I can see that dependency injection could solve the original problem you talked about,
Yeah.
which is people just newing up classes
Yeah.
here and there. There's no
Mhm.
rhyme or reason, or there's
Right.
no real clear understanding.
Right.
And okay, then let's not even go down the route that's saying that they just haven't learned things
No.
correctly yet.
And there's other ways to keep you from doing that. I'm not
Right,
saying
right.
this is a.
So the only thing that dependency injection can solve in that scenario is the newing up part.
Right.
But the fact that the class is written correctly, is the decomposition of the system done correctly, that all dependency
No.
injection is not going to solve.
Yeah, right. It's not going
Okay.
to solve that.
So in other words, if I'm writing spaghetti, I'm still going to write spaghetti, except it's going to be injected into me now.
Yeah. smaller spaghettis. But by doing that though, is when you need to add another feature, you generally can take out there's built-in firewalls around things. You can actually kind of come in and take the section out, rather than it's just we take this piece out, it breaks way over here and all this stuff. It kind of can isolate things for you.
So if a class is, if A depends on B, you're saying you would like to know that A depends on B.
It's not that I want to know it. It's just that
Or you want it to tell you. You want it to declare that it
I want to know where it's coming in at. I don't want it to have to find that it's sneaking in through this little
So
search
okay,
locator.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say A uses a B. A uses a B.
Yeah.
It depends on a B. But there's no source locator.
Yeah.
Do you get?
No.
It's there. You don't have to inject it. But there's
No,
nothing. There's no container. Nothing involved at all. A simply news up a B.
Yeah, I don't mind that because, like I said, I don't use it for every class. I like to try to have DI around my
Testing classes.
Well-
things you want to swap out.
especially external integrations. Like I like to have it for the integration layer, and then any type of stuff that I have for like providers. So like I'll have what I would have something what I call like a provider would be something it's kind of like a service being provided to my application that isn't necessarily an integration.
Like configuration.
Yeah. Or like some sort of algorithm or something like that that could change, like, you know.
So are you drawing the line necessarily where it's like, so I consider my classes, the things that I build, like the
Yeah.
ones that I create mine.
Yeah.
But when it comes to things like file system stuff that's part
Yeah.
of the framework, I don't integrate that into my class, my
Right.
system. I'll put a barrier, I'll put an
Right.
abstraction between me and them.
And I even do that for time itself. Like I don't want to have.
Oh yeah, that's coming from the
yeah,
Java world. Are you a
yeah.
Java programmer?
No, not very long. In school, I can hello world this
I
and this
know
and
Java
everybody
folks
else.
have that issue with date time suddenly. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, they have such a. It's one example you hear all the time where they're saying you should abstract that out so you can test it.
Yeah.
See, my problem with dependency injection to start with, and like even that suggestion, is that you are bending over backwards to test your system. I'm not saying you shouldn't test your system. I'm saying there is a different design that we could use. It
Yeah.
doesn't require you to bend over backwards and damage the design of the system so that you can test.
Yeah.
But so far, all I'm hearing is the need to test, not the need dependency injection fan will admit, but the
Well-
need to test drives the need for dependency injection.
And also too, like I said, if you if you use this as a methodology going into an enterprise application, it does kind of force people to decouple us. I mean, obviously people can still people can find a way to couple, but if you can it forces most people to kind of have a system that's going to be less coupled. And then when we come by and have to do this feature A, it just seems to be on those situations built systems, it's easier to add into it.
Which is really good design, and I'd like to separate out good design from dependency injection. Because
you can do good design without it, but I'm saying like if you have a team of 50 or 60 developers and you're taking on a huge enterprise application, a lot of times if you can push out some methodology that maybe not everybody likes, but that kind of can force people to default to a better way, then you can do that. And in my opinion, DI can fill that need sometimes.
So there's one thing you said that like I'm a little conflicted about as like a developer dealing with all of this day by day, and that is one, I do like constructor injection on classes just because, as Scott said, it clearly defines everything that class is going to be using. And like it makes it really easy when you're developing the feature into the actual production code, right? Because I know everything I need, I know everything every other class needs. The annoying part for me comes to testing it now, because I have to use some sort of mocking framework generally to mock up every single thing a class needs, and sometimes those lists can get pretty long.
So you're saying
it adds a lot of work.
You're saying you like the constructor injection for production code?
For the purpose of being explicit with what a class is using.
But how do you care if the class hydrates 100 classes within itself and never bothers you once about them? Why do you care?
So, when working with a lot of newer developers, and you have a lot of stuff happening that's maybe slightly obfuscated, slightly hidden from them, like Class A is handling all of its dependencies magically, and it doesn't even clearly define them up front in its constructor or something. It confuses them, and you spend a lot of time working through and trying to sort through all of that. But at the same time, the IOC container also does that because they see all these things in the constructor, and they're like, well, how is this class getting all these things? So there's
a distinction, Paul. If I see it in the constructor, I'm wondering about the dependencies. If I don't see it in the constructor, I don't care. There are so many classes in the .NET framework that have hundreds of dependencies, not hundreds, but tens of dependencies. We never even know that exists.
Because as somebody that's developing and is very new, when you're thinking about the .NET framework, you don't even just as like personally from when I started going, you don't even care what the .NET framework is doing. You just assume everything you're pulling from that is just going to work for you. But your own code, the stuff you're actually developing, like having that explicit contract is sometimes really helpful. It really
sometimes is when you have problems.
Pretty much that's the best time. It's like when you have problems, you can see every dependency that's going into the class just up front. You don't have to search around in the class or its functionality or find anything.
Can you explain the problem? Like in what? Give me an example of what is the problem. What is a problem? Like, is it a
coming up with a hypothetical situation on the spot is really hard.
No, I'm just saying. So what I'm just saying, if you're
I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that.
If you're in the debugger will tell you exactly what class is the problem. So at least when you're developing, you know exactly where the problem exists because be the blowing up in a certain place or whatever.
Well, that depends. How well are you logging everything? I mean, if it's a runtime problem, sometimes those can be pretty mysterious as to when it's actually happening or what's actually causing it. You can figure out when and what line and when it actually occurred, but like what causes that? Sometimes it's a little bit more work to figure out.
I have a quick question for you. You say you enjoy or you prefer having your dependencies injected. How do you define what is a dependency you care about versus one you don't? How do you determine that?
I'm more of like a consistency, all or nothing thing. If you're going to start defining what dependencies a class has, all of them should be listed.
So like string builder, like what should I be injecting then? So that's where my question.
So now you're going back to like
it's an object. I mean.
Like I guess this kind of goes back to what Shiv says at that point. I don't know if necessarily I would care so much about things provided by system or the .NET framework itself, but sort of classes that are created by the application or by within the application, something that we're creating. So like
components.
Yeah,
I like
any
to think
sort of
of components
component
of it.
within the application, I'm not too worried. Like, those are the things I want to know about.
Yeah.
Things that are provided to me by Microsoft, like, I'm just going to trust those.
So-
Like, you can new up a string builder, no problem. I'm not worried about that. But if you're newing up, if you're building, like, I can't think of a good example. Again, hypotheticals are hard to come up with on the spot.
Like right in the middle, you just start newing up SQL Server connection
Yeah.
objects and stuff right in the middle of your controllers. And
Well, I guess my question more is around.
Well, I would hope that the SQL stuff is at least abstracted into another class that you're using.
yeah.
My question's more around. I understand injecting or having edges. So edges of my software, yes, I would want that to be pushed in or be given to me. But if I'm running business functionality, I may have a separate class for that I do not want to inject, but I just want it to run. And I don't necessarily. Okay, but then if that's still a dependency, and he's saying that if he injects everything, how do I make that distinction?
Well, I think Paul was saying he doesn't believe in injecting everything. It's just he couldn't come up with a good example of why he determined what.
No, you're saying it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
I'm
That's why I'm a
a,
little consistency.
I am a big fan of consistency, but the distinction, I guess, becomes like, is it a framework provided thing? Like, is Microsoft providing me this? I don't care. Use it, new it up all you want. Is it something that I'm creating? Is it a component of my application? Is it a class that somebody somewhere created and added to my solution file, set of files? Then I would like to see it actually listed as a dependency.
And that's where I'm saying that you could have a object I create, like I've built this object
Yes.
that runs a business function or a simple validation on something. I don't know if I would want something so simple to be injected. I would just new it up, and that's where, because if you do it that way, I feel like your construction will get bigger and bigger and bigger.
It will, but if you don't use the dependency injection at that point for your new portion of the application, I feel like you're kind of like mixing up paradigms within your own app. I feel like if you're going to use dependency injection for your classes, use it everywhere.
Yeah,
Keep it consistent.
I will say though, if it's a really simple thing that's that you're using and it's stateless, then I wouldn't do it up at all. I'd just make it static.
Yeah, you have a singleton of it.
Yeah.
It just exists.
Mm-hmm,
Like-
not single, it's static.
Well, static. Yeah, static. Have it like exist application wide, where it's just one instance. You're good to go.
I would kill. I think we all agree singleton pattern is probably bad though.
I
I don't think it's bad at all. I just think that. So I default to statics.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
need an instance.
Yeah.
Right? The singleton, you need an instance, but you want only one.
Singleton's
Yeah,
all
I'm
right
not a-
as long as somebody doesn't slip some state in there.
Yeah.
Well, same as static. Same as static, right?
I go long.
Yeah, static's great as long as you don't slip some state in
I
there.
don't really use
So,
singletons. So
Winston,
it's
you got
never
something?
been a deficit for me.
Oh, I was just trying to think of an example for Paul. I couldn't think of one either.
It's
Yeah,
really
so,
hard.
Paul, I mean, I'd like to think about this because I'm still not understanding what the problem is. If some classes, I mean, the example I gave on my other video was simple, right? There's a graphics card. You go buy a graphics card, you plug it in the motherboard. That graphics card has got thousands of components. You don't even care about that. The motherboard doesn't even care about that. Just does it match the interface? Good, done. New it up and new it. If everything starts to care about everything else's dependencies, and you're not using an IOC container, it becomes a hell. So you're forced to use an IOC container. But my problem is not that there's an IOC container. My problem is that I don't want to know the dependencies.
So I'm saying if you're using the IOC container, you have that functionality available to you. You may as well exploit
Right.
the functionality that you're bringing in all this overhead.
Right, but-
so you may as well take advantage of it.
But you're saying you prefer to see the things on the constructor. So that's what I'm getting confused.
If I have an IOC container, yes, I prefer to see
Sure,
things in the
of course,
constructor.
yeah, but what if, you
100%.
don't? What if you don't have an IOC container? What if you were to design your own system? You have carte blanche decision-making rights.
Well, I wouldn't use an IOC container.
I don't know if
But
Paul's
It
using
would
that.
probably be more factory.
Would you use dependency injection?
I would.
Or would you have things in the constructor like you were saying earlier?
It really depends on the size and the scope of the application and how much I care about architecting it, right?
Okay.
If it's something very small, I personally, if I'm the only one ever touching it and I'm building a quick application to perform some minor task, I have no problem doing stuff up everywhere.
What if it's a web application with 30 or 40 controllers, roughly?
I probably would use some sort of dependency injection at that point. I
Why is
would.
that?
Because at this point, honestly, I'm just more comfortable with it. I've used it so much throughout all of my development in terms of like enterprise and web development that's just what I would probably go with.
Okay, Brian, you were saying something? You have something in mind?
I'm just thinking through it. My biggest issue is with dependency injection is when you start injecting everything, you get so big and it gets so hard to handle how I want to create something, or I just want to make a simple object. I now have to figure out, okay, this thing it lives here, but now I have to follow my stack to make sure I can push it all the way in. And maybe that's just bad design on the objects. Maybe the objects could be bigger or smaller or stateless. I'm not sure. It's just I've been burned so bad with that it's kind of hard for me to see past it at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I do have something to add on now. I think, so a lot of people seem to like it just because they almost like it as documentation, I guess. And
As in the constructor injection.
yeah, constructor injection. They like seeing it up there, and then like I keep saying I like service locator, and then other people say they don't like using that because they think dependency injection is easier to read. In my mind, I guess that is good for personal preference, but I would argue, liking service locator, that it's not hard to read. It's like learning to ride a bike. Once you do it, you can do it no problem. It's just you gotta make a quick tweak. But I think the bigger issue is with dependency injection. This goes back to testing, and you do have to mock everything, right?
That is my biggest complaint. It gets really annoying.
And I remember being back at Purdue, and when I first learned about unit testing, I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, you want to test your system and see if your system works right. Well, what is your system? It's the whole app, right? So they started teaching us, oh yeah, if you're gonna, you need to mock or stub. They would use stubs and hooks for their words, but they say, oh, you need to stub everything out and create hooks for it, and then test each. And to them, unit testing was like you are testing the classes, and I'm just sitting there like, if you've been in the world a while, you've been brainwashed. But if you're new to the world like I was, it doesn't make any sense at all. Like, why would you test one tiny little thing? You're testing the whole system.
I think using the service locator or some sort of factory pattern, however you want to do it, is much more natural to understand.
Yeah.
I think it's easier for any developer to pick that up. And, they both have overhead. They both have things that you have to look into to figure out how your classes are actually getting the instantiated objects. But service locator is definitely, if you were to sit somebody brand new that had never been introduced to either of them in front of an application that was built, the exact same application, one with the service locator, one with the dependency injection, I'm pretty sure the service locator, they'll have that figured out way before they get through all the DI stuff.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I can talk about the unit testing piece because the reason why you'd want to test the at the unit levels is because let's talk about something that's like an algorithm or something, calculate payroll or something like that. You'd want to be able to test that a lot with all the scenarios that would go into that, rather than just only testing the full system. Because if there's 15 different scenarios that go here, but then every state has its own combination. Now you got 50 times 15. So then if you just test the scenarios here, then the scenarios could be outlandish.
But how is
So
that?
one second though. One second.
I gotta repeat that.
Before you, but when you said why would you just test this? You got your whole system. I think that's maybe the mistake here, because you don't just do unit testing. You do integration testing, and then you do the unit testing where it's needed.
So I think So to me, at least, unit testing is breaking in those chunks. And some people mix up unit testing and functional testing. So like what I mean by test system, just throw some input in, test it. That's to me functional testing. And even if you have all those scenarios, at some point there should be, if you designed your system well, driven by what's going into it. So just throw what you want into your system to test that exact scenario.
Right. So Scott, to your thing about the scenarios part, to me, I have to test it. You know what I mean? If I'm putting that thing out in the business, in production.
And I also have to test it. What I'm saying is...
But I have to test the system end to end to make sure that it does all those scenarios.
I just want to make sure that this is understood. I'm not looking at it as a binary thing, like I do unit testing or I do systems testing. What I'm saying is you do the integration system, automated integrations test end to end, But then it specifically where there's highly computational sections, you'd be insane not to break that off and test it at a unit level as well. And I dare say that you all would write that unit test.
In this case, I 100% agree with Scott. Coming from like my background prior to what I currently do, it was all parallel programming, and having the highly computational, the complex functions that are doing most of the work independently tested from the rest of the application really allows you to identify problems a lot faster. And for like long-term maintenance or adding more features and all of that, if you break something, it's quicker to point out where you broke something rather than if you just did like full application-wide functional testing. It sometimes can get a little like, well, how am I getting this wrong number back? Where did that actually go wrong?
I think all of you, even Austin, is saying essentially, and I don't know what
you do
you're saying,
both.
Scott,
You definitely do both.
But in terms of percentages, which is more?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna say one second, Abe. So I'm not
Depends on the
saying,
application.
so I'm saying I don't like unit testing, but I'm not saying like don't ever do it.
I didn't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying like you should, like everyone just does it. Do it as little as possible. That should be your goal.
Right. So in my world, it says if something is extremely complex or critical to the business,
Yes.
I will test that. But it's not in one class because that thing maybe itself comprised of 4 classes. Meaning, I don't want to know on the outside, right? So I'm always in that situation where I don't want to know what you need to use and you need to use and you need to use.
Yeah, so you decouple a unit even from a class.
Yeah, so I have a class composite test, which I will do in that case. But I'm happy to do it if the team decides to do it because of its complexity or the criticality to the business. Where, like in USPS's case where I was doing something, there were like, million scenarios.
Yeah.
And by the time we finished 10 scenarios from the outside, the entire system, except for this search, had been tested.
Yeah.
So then why would I run a million scenarios from the outside? I might as well do it over here.
And another thing that we use unit testing for that I think that maybe we don't realize we do, and I think we're all doing it, is it's just to shrink that developer cycle. Because like let's say I have to figure out the shipping cost algorithm for this shipping thing. I don't know why. All my examples come from some sort of fulfillment system that I've never worked on, but I want to work on fulfillment. But if I had to do that, it's really complicated. If I had to fire up the whole system every time, or even like create orders and do all this stuff all the way through, just in order to test every time I write a line of code or a couple lines of code just to see what I'm doing, then my cycle is longer than if I can just literally pull this thing out, put it and just like put a harness around that and just fire scenarios left and right. And then if I want to try another one, I can just spin it up in a second. And it just takes that cycle we have from coding, test, and shrinks it down. Most people, the way they code is they'll do some code, and then they'll run the app. It could be
run the app, or you mean like, so he's saying functional tests?
I'm saying the developer cycle, and the way I define that is you write some code, and then you see how it runs. Then you change the code.
I see.
Where you see how it runs.
But
the obscene way you could do that is if I was doing my fulfillment center system, that I would write some line of code here, literally bring up the full app, the back end services the database, and then try one thing. And that could take me 30 minutes. So you can shrink that down.
Yeah, so if you're running a functional test, you're testing the entire system, but your system.
Right.
And it still spins up and collapses pretty quick.
Right.
So would you do that then?
No, I always do the end-to-end integration testing. It's automated, and I do that. But like while I'm coding on this one little feature, first thing I'll do is just throw up a unit test around it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, just so I can.
It's like TDD.
Yeah, so
like
I can
TDD.
just
Okay.
where TDD got its bad rep from is when it was first came out and they were saying, oh, you got to do this pure, write your test, make it fail, and then because there's no code, and then go write your class. I was like, okay, as soon as you tell that, everybody's BS meter is going to go off, and they're like, I don't know, but there is some good things to it.
I'll do that. I get what you're saying. Sometimes it's just, there's so many scenarios you have to account for at the same time.
Yeah, and it speeds up your cycle.
Can break off another.
Yeah,
you have a suite of tests done, and it's as good as running the application.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
And then when you're done, you still have you're going to still do your full end-to-end automated integration test. But you'll leave these tests, and then that piece has got the extra tests. It's just it's all good, right?
Yeah. So you were saying, or with your testing, you do functional, and you're okay to do class level or composite level testing as and when needed,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Brian, what about you?
I think it's interesting when people say unit testing because I think naturally you think of a unit as of a class, and I don't think that is always the best case scenario. And as they were saying, I would definitely have my end-to-end to make sure everything's working, but you have to be very careful with that because I'm working in a system now where they have all these end-to-end tests trying to do every single scenario, and the thing takes 10 minutes to run for me to figure out if everything's working or not. And that's after I've created my tests, which are trying to isolate very specific pieces of that system.
And that's what I was talking about with the developer cycle. You can speed up just.
Okay, so I mean, I can see that it could take time. I personally have never had any of my systems run for 20 minutes testing, and there's hundreds of tests. Test the entire
cells.
system.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that should be a warning your whole system's not designed right.
Sorry?
That's probably a warning your whole system's not designed.
Yeah, there's
well.
something
Yeah.
wrong, or the services you're dependent on, or something is like taking a really long time, and so
Yeah.
things are slowing down. But then, in those situations, you would need to isolate the tests you need to use to test the parts that you need to test. Like it's running the whole thing. It's still an end-to-end test, but are you running the entire system's test, or are you running just the?
So when I'm creating those, I'm running my system and I'm running my test for that. But then I have to spin up the entire thing to make sure my functionality has not changed anything in the entire system. But when that takes you 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you're like, you know what, I'll get some coffee, come back, and you just wasted 15 minutes and 2 tests just failed on you.
But then, I mean, so if you do it, let's say class level unit testing, class level testing, you can just say my class is working. I have no idea whether it broke the system.
Oh, I'm not saying that you do that solely, and I'm not saying you do that for every class. You definitely have to pick and choose what is important to you. It doesn't make sense to me to have tests for everything, which is I think what's happening in this suite is there's just tests for everything, and now everything takes forever to run.
Okay, so I'm gonna just swing the camera around slowly, and the question is, put your hand up if you agree, or or for. Unit test, which is class level test every single class in your system, like most of the systems I've been working on do. Who says yes?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Unit test every class in the system.
Yes.
Unit test every class in the system?
Yes.
Seriously?
So what do you gain from
Please
that?
explain.
He needs to get his contribution points up.
I know what one of the projects gained from that was a bloated test suite of like 200,000 unit tests, and half of them were completely useless.
Okay, I take that back.
Yeah, I know the same system.
Yeah.
DTOs do not necessarily need to be unit tested, like data transfer.
DTO is okay, fine. Yes, a given. Fine.
But if your class has functionality, then yes, I would unit test it.
But wouldn't that get tested when you functional test, see if your whole system works?
Well,
you put in some data to see if your whole system behaves the way it should for a scenario. Naturally, your class is going to get flexed in that too.
It just gives you more confidence in.
Seriously?
It gives me more confidence in the class functionality itself, and then
I'm more confident personally when I can just test the whole system and it works beautifully.
yeah, you still need to do that anyway. Or at least you should.
So
do
you're
that.
going to do 2 times. You're going to do 2 tests. So you'll be doubling up on the tests.
But those are 2 different tests, right?
But you're still testing the same class multiple times.
But in different contexts, different scenarios.
So how would you test if you're not using dependency injection?
Right.
If you're not using dependency injection, how the heck are you going to test every single class in the system?
Well, you write the class level tests for the classes that you want to.
But
write
the
in
class
test.
has a dependency. You're saying you're not using dependency injection. In other words, that class is in creating an instance by itself. A is creating its own dependency. B, it's not asking you to inject it. How are you going to test A?
I was more thinking of functional testing at the class level, testing the
Functional system, functional aspect. So that's functional
Correct.
testing.
correct.
But you're saying you want class level testing. You want to test every class in your system.
Okay, I take that back. I will test the functions of the class of the functionalities within the classes, not necessarily class level.
That is,
That
you
is
just
class
reworded
level,
class
yeah.
level. Yeah.
Class level meaning you're testing a class in isolation.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you're saying you want to do that.
If the classes in question, and again I preface it with details, for example, I would not
Yeah,
need to
no,
do that.
yeah, no details.
Right.
Other way.
Sure, but
So if there are functionalities, but if you have a class and you are relying on, say, for example, end-to-end testing, right? There are many parts that you, at the end of the day, when classes are interacting with each other, right? Testing how they interact with each other, so your meaning of the class is not necessarily the same as testing the specific
Okay,
implementation.
let me
of
ask
the
you
class.
this question. That car you just drove in
Yes,
to this place, that car was tested on the road, on the track,
correct.
to function exactly how the manufacturer thinks it's supposed to function.
Yes.
Are you seeing the parts are misbehaving though?
I'm sorry.
Are the individual parts misbehaving?
Well, I assume that when those parts were created, you have to make sure that they work the way they should before you actually put the
Yes.
whole car together and drive it
No,
to make sure
but
that
no,
it
I'll
works.
tell you,
like that, too.
I've been in this industry, so I'll tell you what happens. The
Right.
only reason that the auto manufacturer expects the pedal manufacturer
Mhm.
to test the pedal is because they didn't make it.
I've been in
I
this.
and
okay.
I can build off of this too. So, for example, let's just talk about the engine. Forget the rest of the car.
Yeah,
They
he's
will
building
build-
his own engine. He's doing his what is it, Mustang, right?
Mustang, yeah. You build the entire engine, and then you see if it works. If
Yes.
something doesn't work, and this is how the industry does it, they tear the engine apart and they get rid of the parts,
That-
and they go, they send it off to be smelted or they have them inspected. It depends on how they do it. But they build the whole engine first, and the whole engine works. It's good. The whole engine does not work. Done. They don't even.
I've
bother
worked
trying
at
to figure it out.
GM's assembly plant for all of their 8 and 6 cylinder engines that go into the Corvettes and all their trucks, which is basically all of their money because they don't make any money off of small cars. On the assembly line, they start with the block, they add in a few parts, then they do an automated test.
That would make
And
sense. to me.
if it gets rejected at that automated test, the people at
No,
that
okay, but hang on,
station
what are they
have a
testing?
chance to fix it.
Are they
Yeah.
testing the parts?
They're
Or are they
te-
testing the clearances and a bunch of other things that are
They're
required?
testing
The assembly.
the parts interacting with the current assembly at every stage.
But they're really testing the assembly. The parts
Yes.
are not being tested.
Yeah, I was about to say.
There's a human. or
The
robot
parts
being-
actually do get tested at a certain point. So let's say it fails at that functional part, right? I just put my crank in and I turn it and there's too much actual, what am I trying to
torque.
Yeah, it requires too much torque to turn the crank, right? They'll pop it out. The person at that station has a chance to, at that point, correct the problem. They run it into the test again, the automated test. If it fails again, it actually goes down to what Austin was referring to. They call it teardown. And that person has to take it apart piece by piece and identify the explicit part that was causing the issue. And anything else that was good is saved and put back onto the line to be put in another
So
engine.
this is so even though it looks
No wonder
like
GM's striking right now.
it seems like you're only for testing individual parts. It's really not. I'll explain myself.
Well, I was just saying that
Yeah.
his analogy was incorrect
But
based
your-
off the actual industry.
But your analogy,
That's all.
your
Well, some
analogy
companies
actually
maybe do
is,
it then,
hang
but
on,
not all companies do
your-
that.
Your analogy is a case in point for what we've been saying all along, which is the manufacturer. Let's say it's a piston that caused the problem for the crank to get jammed or whatever. Right?
Okay.
The manufacturer of the piston supposedly has tested the piston because they have their own QC because GM did not make that part, right? GM mainly is doing the assembly.
Yes.
So
They machine
even
the
though it was
finished
tested,
surfaces
even
there.
though it was
Yes.
tested,
Let's just roll with it.
even though it was tested, 10 days later the crank's not moving correctly. Is case in point that unless you test the whole thing, it has no meaning.
I mean, it's not
To
either
test.
or. though.
Yes, I agree.
It's not that
But no, hang on, let's say
Nobody's
engines-
disagreeing with that.
One
So
second.
yeah, I
Engines-
totally agree with that. Generally, at least in my idea of perfect unit testing is it's like you compartmentalize different portions of functionality. It might not be as granular as doing a single function or method, like a test for every single one of those, but you have some sort of set of functionality that you expect to happen. You provide an input and you get the output, and that's where you would test.
Okay, so keep it kind of general. Are we saying, all of us here, are we saying that we agree with not doing class level testing? Besides you're saying you want to do class level testing.
Yes, on some level, yes.
How do you mean some level? What does that mean? The
Well-
class level is a level. Which
Well,
other level are you talking
What
about?
I'm saying is that
To
if
some of them, some classes.
correct,
Okay, which is kind of what we've been saying all along.
Yeah.
There
Like,
are
I
going to
even
be.
said that, right?
I mean, what I thought you were disagreeing with. I thought where you are going is
My
that you need to
statement
do
was
end-to-end
every
testing.
class.
Every
I mean,
class.
you can't test. First of all,
The-
by the time you
the-
isolate
the
DTOs,
purist-
you've already nullified that statement.
But
Right?
let me
purist,
phrase it
yeah.
a different way. I say, don't test individual classes, or you should not test individual classes like as little as possible. So even all these classes that aren't DTOs, don't test them unless you absolutely have to. So we're kind of we're saying if we agree with that.
There's like the two extremes, right? There's the
Yeah.
people that are like, you have to test every individual component of this application. That means I have to have a unit test for every single function I write, 100%. And then there's the opposite extreme where it's like, I'm not going to test any individual component at all. I'm going to run the whole application, provide it some input, and get the output at the end. So there's like, we're talking about how granular do you want to be? Do you want to test the application as a whole and only test it as a whole? Or do you want to actually go to the point of like, I made a function that adds, these two numbers together. I want to test every single possible combination of numbers I could provide this thing, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of
It's a lot of
There's a lot of
combinations.
combinations.
Some might say it's
What's
infinite.
your answer?
I'm not going to either extremes. I am not going to write. I'm not going to write an entire system.
Okay, tell me what you're going to do.
I'll mix both.
How many in proportion or percentage?
Depends.
Listen, I know exactly where you're going. I just want you to get the answer. How many in terms of percentages are you going to give? Let's call it functional test versus class test. What is the ratio, functional test to class test?
I don't know. Maybe 40%.
42.
40 to 60. So 42 to 60.
It's really hard to give you. So here's it. It really depends on the application that you are writing. If you are writing an application,
It doesn't.
if you are writing an application that is calculation intensive, right? Let's say you are working for a bank, right? There's a lot of computations. There's a lot of business rules around very specific features of the application. That is not the same thing as writing a web app to do something that is not really very calculation intensive. Are you implying that if you say I will do only 10% functional testing for a web app that doesn't have a lot of business rules like a banking application, that you are going to stick with that? I don't think that will work. It depends on the app that you're working on.
So when you're saying business rules, are you implying that the business rule is working in isolation? Or are you implying that it's part of a bigger component?
Well, okay. So when I say depending on the application that you are working on, there are certain apps that are driven by, say, regulations, right? And there are lots of apps that are not necessarily driven by
Hey, I'm
regulations.
going to cut this short because you spent too much time on this. Functional requirements means every single business requirement is being tested. You're not leaving any stone unturned. If this system is supposed to behave like this, you have tested it behaves this way. It's very simple, right?
Right.
Functional. If there are 2,000 scenarios, guess how many tests you got? 2,000. If there are 2 million scenarios, guess how many tests you got? 2 million. Because you have to test every single scenario. It's not an option. You're testing functional requirements. Now, on top of that, I'm saying there are class level tests, which is what Paul was saying. Every method is tested by force. There's no exclusions.
Okay.
I'm asking a simple question. If you're
Right.
going to do both, what's the ratio of functional to class level testing?
I'm saying I can't give you that because for me personally, how I'm going to decide that will depend on what I'm working on, period.
So even though the functional tests you have are testing every scenario,
I have never been in a situation where I go either extreme, where I test every functional scenario or
Why
test.
not?
Huh?
See,
Why not?
let me ask you a question.
Capital One just got hacked, didn't they?
So if you've got something where there's 3 options here, and following
don't use options. Is it a scenario? 1 second, Bill. Don't say things like options. You're adding twists unnecessarily. Let's be clear.
All right, scenarios.
Is it a scenario or is it not a scenario?
I'm talking about the functionality of an application. And when it goes through, it branches here, and there are 3 possibilities. And
So
and after that, there's a separate branch where there's 3 possibilities, and so forth.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm doing unit tests, I'm testing for all three possibilities here. I'm testing for all three possibilities here. If I'm doing an end-to-end test, the way you're talking about, I'm doing 3 times 3, 9.
Of course. So
And so if you keep adding to the complexity of a normal large-scale business application,
listen, I'm
you
not
will
going to change
not
what I'm saying, but I've been doing it.
test
I've been doing it for the
all of
last
those
15
things.
years. This is how I've been testing applications for the last 15 years. Every single scenario, without
Okay.
fail. The only way that system is going to production if I built it is if it's been tested. That's the only way it's going to production. If I know there are so many scenarios in the system, I have to test every one of those. How can I imagine that it's going to work if I didn't test it?
To be fair, though, I think we're all in agreement that we would test every scenario.
No,
It's
you're
just
not.
some-
You're doing class level testing.
Yeah, but some people are saying, I think,
They would go above that.
yeah, some
be
people,
more
I don't think
granular.
anybody here, but some people would say the pure TDD would say, I write my test first no matter what, even if I'm testing a DTO.
Scott, I'll tell you, we don't. I'm not going to say take names like, because this is on YouTube. We don't test every scenario here.
No, I know.
Yeah, but
Because
when you're
we're
asking,
because we're testing unit level, class level testing.
But the
It's
application.
kind of going to what Bill is saying. Because class level testing is lesser code, you should write class level tests because that's less code. And then we have bugs in production because we only tested the classes in isolation. The ratio, Abe, is 10% functional, 100% all classes tested with 10% functional testing, what we call smoke test. Right? Just it's like assemble your the engine and everything else, crank the thing, it starts, cool, that's it, I'm done.
So I guess my follow-up question would then be, so the 10%, like, how did you come up with that?
I'm
with
telling
that
you,
ratio?
just explain that to you. He's building his car, rebuilding his car, right? His engine.
Right.
Put it in, crank the engine, starts, cool, then that's it. Test it. This work. Because every part has been tested. So you have the confidence to go to production because the car actually started. Now if it was going to fail 2 seconds later, or if it can't perform it's a souped up engine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if it doesn't
High
perform the way it's
temperature
supposed
track.
to perform.
He's flexing on you now.
So, Abe,
Maybe
let me
able
ask
to
you.
operate at 100 degrees. What about 200 degrees when I'm flying around a corner?
I think part of the problem that Shiv's trying to get at is, or at least with his percentage thing, the ratio thing that he's pointing out, is when you focus a lot more on the individual class testing and the individual function, like function or method testing, you end up overlooking the actual functionality, the whole thing as a application itself.
Yeah.
And you confuse that because you're like, oh, all of my individual functions, my methods are working correctly, so that means the whole thing should be working. And then you end up, it's because you've spent so much time testing one individual component or the smaller components, you don't invest as much time testing the whole application. Because that happens a lot. Like
Yeah.
you get a lot of tests for all these little
And the
individual
reason-
pieces, but you never check the whole thing for every possible.
The reason I'm bringing this up is there's a divide in the software community, right? The one is the more prominent one is there's a pyramid or a triangle, I don't know how they call it a pyramid each time. All I'm seeing is a triangle.
It's 2D, so it's it's a triangle.
It sounds cooler as a pyramid.
So and the bottom most layer is the unit tests, and they're saying have the maximum number of unit tests because you've got to test every single class, and the tip of that thing is your functional tests, and the ratios of your tests should be like the functionals are the least and the unit tests are the most. And I flip that pyramid around just like I do with my diet. Just flip it around and say that's the right way to go.
He just had to
I
bring
think
it
I just
up.
think that
He had to bring
But
it up.
both these pyramids, right? The food pyramid and the unit testing pyramid.
They don't use the pyramid.
I think
anymore.
regulators
What is
ban
that? I
pyramid
have no idea.
schemes.
It's not
I don't
the
think that's
pyramid.
allowed.
So, but that's why I'm harping on it because if I told you I've got 2,000 tests that test the entire system, all scenarios that I know that have been given by the business requirements, whatever. Where's the value of adding class level tests? I don't understand.
So if you were working on Amazon's fulfillment system, that's a pretty complex application, right? So how many end-to-end tests would you write for that?
Anything that's required, Scott.
But what I'm getting at is
I
there's
can't
value
say,
for the unit tests as well because they help flesh out some of these things that could be for, because if you say I do end-to-end testing, you can also slip up and miss an edge case that happens at the unit level as well, because you've done the happy path, you've done a few, but you missed one of the paths, and even if you said where's my code coverage, it would show up on one of those other paths, but not necessarily.
yeah. So there are situations.
Yeah.
There are some situations, and it goes beyond that scenario business. Right? It's a value of an argument that is not considered a new scenario, but
Right.
nonetheless needs to be tested separately.
Right.
And those are the tests that, and this is again only for those parts of the system that you decide as a team is
Yeah.
either critical or complex to the business. There's absolutely no other reason to do it. It's not about code coverage. It's not about edge cases. It's really about, is this functionality so complicated to test? And I'll give you another reason for doing this.
Yeah.
If you have a suite of tests that test this complexity, comes time to rewrite it tomorrow, you have a suite of tests that can help you rebuild that same thing again because the
Yeah.
tests are in place, right? But I've had to do this in many cases, including here. But it's a by choice. You can't say that I'm going to do it. Some systems don't have that complexity.
So, what would you suggest in a situation in which, application-wide, there is potentially an infinite number of scenarios?
You don't
Oh,
know
it's like this method takes an int, so now there are going to be 2 billion scenarios.
I mean, I can give an actual example for this, and I don't have to make it up. Like genetics, right? I've worked on applications that do analysis on genetics. Our data set was terabytes large, so that's all the possible scenarios that we currently know of. But there's even more beyond that.
Sure, but that's why the human genome project took so many years on older computers,
Yeah.
right? Because they couldn't say we just going to.
It's impossible. It's
the
it's
thing
too
is,
difficult.
Again,
Right.
I think
function
Fun
test.
fact, they didn't take a shortcut. It was like 1,000 or so genes or longer to encode the protein. If it was under that, they skipped the protein. And they're finding out there's a lot of proteins out there that are really important because they did that.
yeah, okay, maybe now they
So-
know better.
So,
but
so
Just to fry
it
that.
isn't about. I can tell
I
you
know
more
your
about
point,
this
though.
afterwards. But yeah, it's like.
I'm talking about scenarios. I'm not talking about permutations to a function or a method call. I'm talking about scenarios, which is an idea from a business standpoint, saying if this occurs, the system should do that. If I gave you this and this, the system should be doing this. If something else occurs, I'm not talking about like
Okay.
permutations to like the possible permutations to a method call. That's not the same thing as scenario.
Well, in a way, but this is more, I guess, a isolated problem to like distributed systems, where different permutations can create different scenarios and how you distribute data and how you handle the problem in solving it.
So in a situation like that, and I'll give you I can give you an example like we had with set of rules that I was given. These rules are, of course, by state and a bunch of other parameters. So there's a rule or a set of rules that apply to, let's say, 6 criteria, or the combination of those 6 criteria. The way I was given the rules was, there were like 700 rules. But when I looked at it and I distilled that down, there were only 200. So instead of writing 700 tests, I'll be actually writing 200 tests, because the way they presented it, it seemed like there were 700 raw tests.
But
they
in
weren't.
actual application, there were only certain combinations of them, so you could actually
It's
narrow it.
like, yeah, if you normalize the database
Yep.
down, you find there's lesser data you're dealing with. But it looks like there's a lot of data, right? So once I understood what the requirement was, I looked at the rules. I said, okay, so there's actually only 200 rules. Why are you saying there's 700 rules? And they said, oh, but it didn't seem like that. But so in that sense, I would distill it down to 700 permutations versus 200 scenarios. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
there are some valid ones, and the others you can kind of just. It's like writing a calculator, class and adding the plus in it. How many tests do you want to have to write to say that 2 plus 2 actually equals 4, and then the add method actually functions before you give up and say, okay, I've gone from minus 2 billion to plus 2 billion times 2 billion times.
Yeah, no, that's a hard thing to explain to juniors too, because if they are savvy on the theoretical side, it's like no, you gotta like learn to put things in the real world. Sometimes if someone's like highly technical but they're junior,
Right.
that's a problem I've seen from that direction. Is like calm down, like think realistically what can actually happen.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Okay, so just to round up, none of us actually believes in doing dependency injection wholeheartedly across the system, right? None of us seems to rely therefore on mocking also, right? For the same reason. And we don't necessarily think we should be testing classes in isolation also by force. It's a case by case basis, but for the most part, Abe, I don't know if you're still agreeing or not. For the most part, it's functional / acceptance tests and unit tests or class level or composite tests on a case by case, as and when needed or wanted basis, but not like every class is going to be tested also in isolation and functional tests, because that's what you started off.
I feel like you waste a lot of time if you were to do it. Like,
Yeah, you're literally
as granular as Abe was suggesting.
Yeah, I think we all kind of agree. Pick the right tool for the right job in moderation, and not don't go absolute on any of this stuff. You know, just
right. And
try to think about what makes sense. And
are we agreeing with the pyramid being inverted? The functional to unit class level testing, like the
definitely.
ratios.
especially if you think about like all the different classes that you would never touch, like the boilerplate stuff that you have to write. You wouldn't.
No, but let's say all the business functional business classes that do some meaty business work. Would you
I would think so.
think so? What?
It's hard to think in the abstract.
I mean, given that you're writing functional tests, you might as well say, I'll just write all the functional tests I need to test, therefore all the classes have been tested anyway, the ones that matter.
Just from experience working on applications, I have to agree with it, just because every application that I've worked on that have done, like, focused on much more granular testing, they completely neglect the whole application functional testing, and then you, like you said, you always end up with a ton of bugs because of that. And then you're sitting there trying to figure out why these individual parts, which were thoroughly tested, aren't interacting well together. And that's a headache to sort out.
Yeah. Plus, if you're functional testing well, hitting every business scenario, but you're missing cases in your code, and let's just say it's straight up as easy as your code coverage is still lacking, well, then your design's bad. You have unused code even as bad as that, potentially.
So if you have unused code after you finished all your functional scenarios, functional tests with all the scenarios, what do you do with that code?
Delete it.
That's what I would do.
Comment it out for later.
Yeah, I commented out.
It's already a version, right? There's already some, I'm hoping.
No, you commented out. I like to see the green code in there.
Yeah.
Just in case?
No, in case they think that I didn't do a lot of work, I can show, I did this.
No, you do two pull requests, one with the code and then the other with the comment out. You got the history.
Because the best metric
just
to
spent a
measure a
whole week
developer
writing
on is
this
how many
code,
lines
but
of
I'm
code they
confident.
actually wrote.
Yeah, I'll tell you, remind me after.
Okay, so I guess we did you want to continue or should we just conclude?
I think this is a perfect stopping point.
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point.
Okay, so since the thing also stopped.
Oh, perfect.
So before I forget.
So actually I was expecting for some more excitement, but apparently we all agreed.
It was exciting with you and Bill.
Yeah. Well, he was over here
Great.
suggesting that one of us should take the camera and just like record you two.
And then you're yelling at him like, "What's the percent? What's the percent?
I know, right?
I need a percent."
You're not leaving till you give me a percentage.
He's like, "You want the truth? You can't handle the truth. You want me on that wall. I'm writing code you don't even want to dream about."
Well, here we are at the end of the debate. Before I end this video, I wanted to take this opportunity to clarify some things that were discussed in the video, primarily the notion of functional testing versus isolated class testing. So let's start with the unit testing, which is the general understanding in the software community is testing classes in isolation. And this is done across the board. You're not picking and choosing which classes to test, you're testing every class in isolation. So when I say unit testing as regards to the conventional practice or the common practice, what I mean is testing in isolation. And I'm not sure why there was this confusion about testing in isolation versus functional tests, but in case some of you got confused with that whole thing, I want to just clarify and let you know that this is what I mean, or what people generally mean when they say unit testing especially in the context of dependency injection and mocking. So since the debate was on dependency injection and mocking, then unit testing implies testing all classes in isolation across the system. You're not picking and choosing the classes, you are just by force testing all classes in isolation. And the functional tests are tests that are typically end-to-end. In other words, you're not picking and choosing classes, you're testing the entire system end-to-end. What are you testing? You're testing functional requirements. These are business requirements. And again, every requirement can have n number of scenarios. So let's say if there are y requirements with n scenarios, then that's y times n tests. So I'm not sure what Abe was saying, and maybe he's saying, the same thing, just the way he was trying to get there was different. But as you saw, generally, for the most part, the others in the debate were in agreement that they would prefer to do a majority of tests that were functional and then some tests at a class level. My stand on this is, even though it might seem similar, I just want to, since some of you are kind of probably wanting to go and do something about this in your systems, in the work you're doing today, I want to just clarify, since I haven't actually done a full out unit testing video that explains all the details here. Functional requirements are functional requirements. My tests are functional. I call them acceptance tests, which is kind of the same thing. Sometimes I've used the word functional, sometimes I've used the word acceptance tests. Essentially, it means end-to-end. Now, what does end-to-end mean? There's some sort of debate, or it depends on what kind of system you're building. But essentially, all the parts and pieces that you build, and all the parts and pieces that you depend on. That would include your database. That would include any services you have, any third party could be other teams in the organization or external services that you depend on. You're testing the whole thing. Now, I understand there may be some scenario difficulty in regards to testing with external systems or other systems that you didn't build. That's again a detail that I'm not going to go into. There are, of course, ways and means to determine when and when not to use those systems, or maybe use them for some scenarios, some tests and not others. But in my mind, out of the box, out of the gate, I'm testing the entire system end to end. And with regards to the ratios that I was trying to get Abe and others to come up with, my answer is 100% of my tests are functional. Does that mean that's the only test I do? And I'll explain that. But essentially what I'm saying is I have to test every functional requirement. There's no way in hell I'm going to production unless I have tested every single functional scenario. I just can't do it. You can twist my arm, it will break, but I'm not going to production without functional requirements. There are tests for every single functional requirement that I know of, that I've been told of, that I've discovered, however you want to dice it. Does that mean that's the only test I write in the system? No. Sometimes yes, but not all the time. There are times when, because of the way you implemented a certain feature, in the way that the classes, the technical aspect, you might not feel comfortable not having tests for those classes. I call that a composite class test, because invariably it's not just one class. I mean, one class doing something really complicated, in my mind, I don't think that exists. So typically, in my mind, it's a composite. It's a collection of classes that perform a certain business function or a set of functions, related functions, for the business. And it is so complicated, the implementation, that I'm deciding to write tests. This is a technical requirement, meaning it's not a business requirement. It's not like I would go to production with just functional tests in mind, in place. But I wouldn't be comfortable doing that. If you twisted my arm, I'd say, yeah, let's go. I mean, I got all the tests. I am very sure my system is working correctly. My functional tests are the ones that tell me my system is working correctly. No other test that I write is telling me that. So the fact that I decide to write some class composite tests is by choice, but primarily it's a technical choice. Now there could be another choice which is somewhat business related, where, for example, the same functionality is so critical to the business. For your technical person's sanity check. Not for business reasons, but for your own sanity. You might, as a team, decide that that composite of classes, because of the nature of the function it provides to the business, maybe it's critical to the business, or it's complex in terms of the technical aspects of it, you can choose to write composite class tests. So yes, there are those tests will exist or may exist in a system, but they're not the reason I'm going to production. None of those tests is going to give me the assurance that I can go to production. And I'm trying to distinguish this because it's very clear. It should be. Everything in my head should be so clear to everybody else, right? It should be clear to people that I'm hoping that functional tests is what I use to go to production with. I might write other tests as well. So my answer to Abe's question, or the question I asked Abe, not Abe's question, is 100% of my tests are functional. I may have other tests, but they are inconsequential for the, let's say, the litmus test of me, can I go to production or not? And that's kind of, I wanted to just explain that. Bill made a mention of a scenario where a method might have 3 scenarios. And then that class is using another class that's also got 3 scenarios. And I'm not quite sure what he was trying to say there as in completely, but I'll choose a couple of things that I think he was trying to say. One is, well, if you were to test the class independently, there's 3 tests here, there's 3 tests there, there's 6 tests. The other way, there'll be 9 tests. And you extrapolate that into a larger system, and you got so many more tests that you got to write because you're writing them at a functional level. And my answer to Bill in the debate itself was yes. I mean, I would do it anyways because I'm testing functional scenarios. I'm not testing some class and determining what test to write based on a class. I don't care what the class is. See, my functional tests are end to end. I'm never testing a class or classes. I'm testing a boundary of the system. That's it. I don't know what the class is or classes are in the system, and I don't want to know what the classes are. In fact, that's the other advantage of writing functional tests or end-to-end tests, at least the way I implement and design my systems. So I won't go into the details of that, but essentially, I can refactor my systems 10 ways and my test will not break. I mean, if the re-implementation was correct, what I'm trying to say is that because my tests are not tied to a class or classes, I can refactor the system and run the tests, and if all the tests pass, my system is back to the way it used to work, as compared to the older design. The functionality has not changed. I've refactored, I've used my tests, the functional tests, to ensure my system is behaving exactly the way it was behaving correctly, and therefore exactly the way it's supposed to. You can't do this with class level testing or testing classes in isolation, which is why my sort of desire to write functional tests it's an evolution. It has been an evolution over like 15 years. So I didn't start off my software career writing functional tests only. But what's happened is over the years of experiences, other people's experiences, my own experiences, that experiences inform me that functional tests are it. That is all you need, and that's all you should be focusing on. Don't waste your time, spend your time doing other kinds of tests, not to help you go to production, right? And the other benefit, as I said, with the functional tests is the fact that your tests remain unchanged. So let's say, and refactoring also should be explained. Refactoring implies that you are cleaning up your code. The requirements have not changed. So if the requirements are not changed, but you want to refactor, go right ahead. If you make a mistake, your test will break. If you didn't make a mistake, that all tests will pass. Your system is behaving exactly how it was behaving before you started the refactoring effort. Because you're not modifying your tests, you're not touching your tests. You can't pull that off at a class level. Because refactoring also implies maybe new classes come in, maybe old classes disappear, maybe some classes get collapsed into one, and maybe others break up into multiple. So for me, the answer, the choice is very, very clear. So I'm not able to understand not just the people in the debate who were, I guess, Abe and Bill for the most part. And I feel sort of unfair to call that out, but it's not an Abe or a Bill thing. It's the reason I was hopping on this in the debate was I kind of caught Abe as the scapegoat, because I found one person who was saying what he was saying, but he's not alone. There are many, many people who think in those terms, and the same is what what Bill was saying. If there are 9 scenarios, I mean, I don't know, is Bill saying, again, Bill meaning I'm using Bill as the kind of the person or the people who would agree with him. Are they saying that they are willing to go to production with 6 tests in this case because 9 tests is too much? Which brings me to the other aspect, and I mentioned this in the mocking video, the previous video. I am doing what I should be doing. If it means I have to write 9 scenarios or 9 tests, that's what I'm writing. I'm not doing what I can. I'm always trying to do what I need to be doing, what I should be doing. And I think that is a big mistake in the software community, where people are always making choices based on what they can do, what's easier, what's less. Do what needs to be done. It to me doesn't sound like it's more. You know what I mean? I mean, if I'm building a system, let's say I'm saying, yep, I'm going to build the system. In my mind, I'm going to do what it takes to make sure that system is working the way it's supposed to. I'm not going to take shortcuts. I'm not going to pick and choose and whatever. Now, the thing is, at work, at workplaces, people have accused me of being uncompromising. Yeah, I mean, in these regards, I am. And then they say you're a perfectionist and, you have to let go or do, they're not saying it, but that's effectively they're saying you have to do, half-assed work. I'm not capable. I can't put my name, as it were, on something that I am not comfortable with. So maybe those are battles you have to deal with. But I think that's the reason the software industry gets such a bad rap. It's called software because it's constantly changing and breaking. In hardware, there are fewer bugs. So anyway, I don't want to drag on this whole thing, but I hope you enjoyed this debate. And yes, I do recognize there are things that can be improved, and including the way I moderate the debate needs to be improved or can be improved. So I'm going to also be learning that aspect, and that stupid cameraman, probably need to throw him out and find somebody else to do that, the sound and the camera. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to give me your comments and feedback and likes, dislikes, desires, etc. And I will see you next time.